and the family loved them. Everyone seemed blissfully happy.
Rachel set up a website, Neil and Rachel, and she was constantly updating people on how perfect her life was and how beautiful her baby was and how handsome her husband was.
The winter morning of January 22nd, 2006, began like any other in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Hopkinton, Massachusetts. The snow lay thick on the ground, muffling the sounds of the awakening town that proudly called itself the starting point of the Boston Marathon. But inside the four-bedroom colonial house at 6 Cubs Path, a horror beyond imagination had already unfolded. One that would shatter not just one family, but ripple through 2 continents and into the hearts of everyone who heard the story. They say you can choose your friends, but family is forever. For Neil Entwistle, this saying would become his ultimate deception, his most calculated lie, and eventually his complete undoing. On the surface, Neil had everything a man could want: a devoted wife who adored him, a beautiful baby daughter who gurgled with joy at the sight of his face, and a serene home in one of Massachusetts' most coveted communities. But beneath this picture-perfect facade lurked a darkness so profound, so twisted in its selfishness, that it would culminate in an act of betrayal that defied every natural instinct of love and protection. Neil Entwistle was not born a monster, though his actions would ultimately brand him as one. Growing up in the working-class coal-mining town of Worksop in Nottinghamshire, England, Neil lived a life that was unremarkable in its ordinariness. His father toiled deep underground in the coal mines, his hands permanently stained black from years of honest labor, while his mother served meals to school children in the local canteen, her days filled with the cheerful chatter of young voices. Neil shared this modest home with his younger brother Russell, and on the surface, their childhood was typical of countless families in post-industrial Britain. But even as a young boy, Neil carried within him a shame that would grow like a cancer over the years. He was embarrassed by his family's humble circumstances, mortified by his father's coal-stained clothes and his mother's simple job. When he spoke, his thick Cockney accent marked him immediately as working class, a label he would spend his entire adult life trying to shed. This was a mere teenage rebellion or natural ambition. It was a deep-seated rejection of his own identity, a poisonous self-hatred that would eventually consume everything good in his life. The University of York became Neil's escape route from what he saw as his shameful past. There, surrounded by students from more privileged backgrounds, his insecurities only deepened. He was brilliant academically, working toward a master's degree in electronic engineering with a kind of focus that comes from desperation rather than passion. Every achievement was not a celebration of learning, but a step further away from the cold dust and cafeteria smells of his childhood. He dreamed constantly of a life of luxury and sophistication, a life where no one would ever know about his humble beginnings. It was during this time of internal struggle that fate intervened in the form of Rachel Souza, a young American woman who had come to York as part of a study abroad program. Born on December 14th, 1978, in Weymouth, Massachusetts, Rachel had faced her own share of loss and hardship. She had lost her father, Paul, when she was young, a tragedy that shaped her into someone who understood the preciousness of family and the importance of holding tight to those you love. Where Neil saw his background as something to escape, Rachel embraced her roots and the people who mattered to her. The attraction between Neil and Rachel was immediate and powerful. For Neil, Rachel represented everything he believed he wanted. She was American, sophisticated, well-educated, and came from a middle-class family that seemed glamorous compared to his own. For Rachel, Neil's intelligence and his apparent vulnerability drew her in. She saw in him someone who needed love, someone she could nurture and support. What she couldn't see, what no one could see at the time, was that Neil's love was conditional, transactional, and ultimately selfish. Their courtship unfolded with all the intensity of young love. Neil would often declare with passionate certainty that Rachel was the one, the person he wanted to spend his life with. But even in these early days, there were signs of the manipulative nature that would later turn deadly. Neil was already crafting a version of himself that bore little resemblance to reality, already learning to tell Rachel what she wanted to hear rather than what was true. After graduation, they decided to start their life together in earnest. They settled in Redditch, about 15 miles south of Birmingham, where Neil managed to secure a position with a computer company. It seemed like the beginning of a fairy tale. The working-class boy who had risen above his circumstances, the American girl who had found love across the ocean. Rachel threw herself into her new life with characteristic enthusiasm, landing a job teaching English and theater at St. Augustine's Catholic School. Her colleagues and students quickly grew to love her warmth, her genuine care, and her infectious laughter that could brighten even the dreariest British afternoon. Their wedding on August 10, 2003, at the Second Parish Church of Plymouth in Massachusetts, was everything a young couple could dream of. Rachel was radiant in her white dress, her smile genuine and full of hope for the future. Neil, handsome in his suit, played the part of the devoted groom perfectly. Rachel's family welcomed him with open arms, seeing only the man their daughter loved, not suspecting the carefully constructed facade he presented to the world. For a time, it seemed their happiness was complete. Rachel worked as a teacher of English, drama, and theater studies at St. Augustine's Catholic High School in Redditch, where she formed deep bonds with her colleagues and students. Outside of work, she built a vibrant circle of friends, always the one to organize gatherings, always the first to offer help when someone was in need. Her life was full in a way that comes from genuine connection and purpose. But for Neil, the reality of marriage was far different from his fantasies. The problem wasn't Rachel. She was everything he claimed to want. The problem was Neil himself. Despite all his efforts to reinvent himself, he remained fundamentally insecure about his background. His thick workshop accent betrayed his origins every time he spoke. In social situations, he felt like a fraud, convinced that everyone could see through his middle-class pretensions to the coal miner son beneath. This internal battle held him back from pursuing better opportunities, leaving him feeling trapped in a life that, while comfortable, didn't match his grandiose visions of success. Their daughter Lillian was born on April 9, 2005, and for a brief moment, it seemed like fatherhood might ground Neil, might give him the sense of purpose and belonging he had always lacked. Lillian was a beautiful baby, with her mother's gentle nature and bright eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with wonder. Rachel was transformed by motherhood, throwing herself into caring for her daughter with the same passionate devotion she had once given to her students. But instead of bringing the family closer together, Lillian's birth seemed to highlight the growing chasm between Neil's dreams and his reality. The financial pressures of supporting a family made his modest income feel even more inadequate. Worse, he watched Rachel blossom as a mother and realized that she had found fulfillment that he couldn't provide, couldn't even understand. Her joy in their simple family life only emphasized his own persistent dissatisfaction. It was Neil who suggested the move to America, framing it as an opportunity for Rachel to be closer to her family, especially now that they had little Lillian to share with her grandparents. Rachel, always trusting, always wanted to support her husband, saw the logic in his argument. She loved her job at St. Augustine's and had built meaningful friendships in Redditch. But the idea of her parents being able to play a bigger role as grandparents was appealing. She couldn't know that Neil's real motivation was his belief that in America, with its mythology of reinvention and success, he might finally become the person he had always pretended to be. The lies began even before they left England. Neil told his employer that he had personal matters to attend to and that the move to America was necessary to keep Rachel happy. But he didn't tell anyone, not even Rachel, that he had actually quit his job entirely. Instead, he allowed everyone to believe that he would be working remotely for a computer company, maintaining the fiction that their move was temporary and financially secure. The deception was breathtakingly cruel in its calculation. Rachel, trusting her husband completely, made the wrenching decision to leave behind her career, her friends, and the life she had built in England. She said goodbye to her students at St. Augustine's, many of whom cried at her farewell party. She packed up their belongings, including all of Lillian's baby things, and prepared for what she thought was a new chapter in their family story. She had no idea that her husband had already begun the process that would lead to their destruction. Once in Massachusetts, the young family moved in with Rachel's mother and stepfather, Priscilla and Joe Matarazzo, in Carver. The Matarazzos welcomed Neil warmly, treating him as the son they had never had. Joe, in particular, took Neil under his wing, sharing his interests and tried to help him feel at home in America. It was during one of these bonding sessions that Joe made a decision that would later prove fatal. He took Neil shooting, introducing him to his collection of firearms that he kept securely locked in a box. Neil, with his characteristic need to appear knowledgeable even when he wasn't, initially tried to seem comfortable with the guns. But his inexperience was obvious, and Joe, being a responsible gun owner, guided him toward the smallest weapon in the collection, a .22 caliber revolver. It was meant to be a harmless afternoon of target practice, a way for Joe to share his hobby with his son-in-law. Neither man could have imagined that this simple act of familial bonding was providing Neil with the knowledge he would later use to commit the most heinous act imaginable. The search for their own home became the next chapter in Neil's elaborate deception. They found a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial house at 6 Cubs Path in Hopkinton, a property that should have been far beyond their means given that Neil had no legitimate income. But Neil, with his gift for manipulation, convinced the owner to let them rent it on a short-term 3-month lease for $2,700 per month, plus an upfront payment of $5,400 for the first and last month's rent. The story Neil told was masterful in its detail and believability. He claimed to be waiting for his offshore accounts to transfer to the United States, painting a picture of international business success that dazzled the landlord. He spoke confidently about purchasing the house outright once his funds were available, his English accent lending an air of sophistication to his lies. The landlord, impressed by this apparently successful young family, agreed to the arrangement, but the truth was far more sinister. Neil was funding their lifestyle through an elaborate web of credit card fraud and online scams that revealed the true depths of his character. He had accumulated approximately $40,000 in credit card debt, all while maintaining a facade of financial stability to his wife and her family. His obsession with appearing successful had driven him to create multiple fraudulent websites designed to separate vulnerable people from their money. One of these schemes, called Million Maker at Sea UK, promised participants they could earn $6,000 a month within 6 months, charging a $90 setup fee and $25 monthly for support. Another venture, Embedded New Technologies Limited, was nothing more than a shell company with Neil as the primary contact, offering no actual products or services. Senior Publications claimed to offer earnings of $20,000 a month for just a couple of hours of work per week, charging desperate people $60 to join a program that existed only in Neil's imagination. The scope of his criminal activity was staggering. He operated a pornographic website featuring barely legal women, preying on the most vulnerable members of society for profit. He sold penis enlargement schemes to insecure men and created countless other fraudulent operations designed to exploit human desperation and hope. Court records would later reveal that in the month before the murders, he had lost hundreds of dollars gambling on Casino One, a site operated by a company based in Gibraltar. Perhaps most tellingly, Neil had begun taking people's money through eBay without delivering the promised products. He sold what he called business manuals that were supposedly guides to his get-rich-quick schemes, but buyers received nothing for their money. When eBay shut down his account and launched an investigation, Neil's primary source of fraudulent income was eliminated, adding financial pressure to his already unstable psychological state. The cracks in Neil's facade were becoming impossible to hide. Rachel discovered that one of Neil's credit cards had been frozen, and when she confronted him about their finances, he refused to answer her questions. This was perhaps the first moment when Rachel began to understand that the man she had married, the man she had followed across an ocean and trusted with her future, was not who he claimed to be. The psychological pressure on Neil was immense, but rather than coming clean and seeking help, he began to plan the unthinkable. His Google search history from this period reads like a roadmap to murder, revealing a mind that had crossed from deception into homicidal intent. He searched for quick suicide methods, best way to kill someone, and knife and neck kill. He found online forums where anonymous users discussed the most effective ways to commit murder, even researching whether it was better to stab someone below the rib cage or aim for the aorta. Simultaneously, Neil's search history revealed another aspect of his deteriorating mental state, an obsession with sexual gratification that had become disconnected from his relationship with his wife. He spent hours browsing escort services, looking at Adult Friend Finder and halfpriceescorts.com. He downloaded maps for escort services in Worcester, just 30 minutes from their Hopkinton home. This wasn't casual browsing. It was the behavior of a man whose fundamental understanding of human relationships had become completely corrupted. The planning for his escape was equally methodical. Neil researched flights to the UK on multiple websites, looking at options through Manchester Airport and British Airways. He wasn't just planning a crime. He was planning his getaway, already envisioning himself back in England, free from the responsibilities and consequences of his actions in America. Rachel, oblivious to the danger growing in her own home, was focused on preparing for a visit from her college friends. She wanted everything to be perfect, working tirelessly to unpack boxes and organize their new house. Between caring for 9-month-old Lillian and trying to make their rental house feel like a home, she was exhausted by the end of each day. After putting Lillian to bed, Rachel would often fall asleep quickly, leaving Neil alone with his thoughts and his plans. January 20th, 2006, dawned cold and gray, just another winter day in Massachusetts. Neil told Rachel he was going to the mall to pick up some computer equipment. A lie so casual and mundane that it revealed the depths of his deception. Rachel, trusting as always, didn't question him. She was busy with Lillian in the house, never imagining that her husband was embarking on a mission that would destroy everything she held dear. Instead of going to the mall, Neil drove to his in-laws' house in Carver, knowing that Joe and Priscilla were at work, using the spare key they had given him as a sign of trust and acceptance. He let himself in and went directly to the locked box where Joe kept his firearms. The irony was crushing. Joe had welcomed Neil into their family, had tried to bond with him through their shooting excursions, and now that same trust and acceptance was being used to facilitate the murder of Joe's beloved daughter and granddaughter. Neil took the .22 caliber revolver, the same gun Joe had recommended for him as a beginner, the same weapon he had used during their family bonding sessions. As he drove back toward Hopkinton, Neil was crossing a line from which there could be no return. The man who had spent years crafting elaborate lies about his success and sophistication was about to commit the most cowardly and brutal act imaginable. Back at 6 Cubs Path, Rachel was upstairs in the master bedroom with little Lillian. It was a scene of domestic tranquility that should have represented everything Neil claimed to want: a beautiful wife, a healthy daughter, a comfortable home. But Neil's capacity for appreciation and gratitude had been corroded by years of resentment, insecurity, and selfish ambition. What should have been his greatest treasures had become, in his twisted perception, obstacles to the life he believed he deserved. The exact sequence of events that followed Neil's return home may never be fully known, but the physical evidence tells a story of unimaginable cruelty. Autopsy results show that Rachel died of a gunshot wound to the head and Lillian of a gunshot wound to the torso. The bullet that passed through Lillian also pierced Rachel's left breast. Authorities believe that Rachel was holding Lillian when Neil entered the bedroom with the gun, meaning that this wasn't a crime of sudden passion, but a calculated execution of his own family. The bullets were so small that the one in Rachel's head went undetected until the autopsy, a detail that speaks to the cold efficiency of Neil's planning. He had chosen a weapon that would be effective but would minimize obvious signs of trauma, perhaps already thinking about how the scene might be interpreted by investigators. The psychological horror of these final moments is almost impossible to comprehend. Rachel, seeing her husband enter the room with a gun, must have experienced a confusion so profound that her mind could barely process what was happening. This was the man she had married, the father of her child, the person she had trusted above all others. In those final seconds, she must have tried to understand how the person she loved could be pointing a weapon at her and their baby. For Lillian, just 9 months old, there was no understanding, only the terror of sudden violence and pain. She died in her mother's arms, never knowing why the person who was supposed to protect her had become her destroyer. The innocence of her young life makes Neil's crime particularly heinous. She had never hurt anyone, never even had the chance to form memories of her father beyond his face and voice. After the murders, Neil's behavior revealed the calculating nature of his character. Rather than calling for help or showing any genuine remorse, he began implementing the next phase of his plan. He left the house, leaving the bodies of his wife and daughter in the blood-soaked bed, and drove to Logan International Airport. There, he abandoned the family car, the keys still in the ignition, and boarded a flight to England. But before leaving the country, Neil made one final manipulative gesture. He called his father, Clifford, and delivered a carefully crafted story about finding Rachel and Lillian dead when he returned from the mall. According to Neil's account, he had called the police and then, in a state of panic, had driven to Joe and Priscilla's house for support. Finding no one home, he claimed to have made the decision to fly back to England to be with his parents during this tragic time. The story was designed to portray Neil as a grieving husband and father, someone so traumatized by the discovery of his family's bodies that he had fled to the comfort of his childhood home. It was a narrative that played on every parent's sympathy, designed to make his departure seem like the understandable reaction of a man in shock rather than the calculated escape of a murderer. Meanwhile, back in Hopkinton, Rachel's college friends arrived for their planned visit, excited to see their old friend and meet little Lillian. When no one answered the door, their initial confusion turned to concern. They could hear Rachel's phone ringing inside the house, a sound that filled them with inexplicable dread. They found a note from Priscilla, Rachel's mother, but its contents only increased their anxiety. These friends, who had come to celebrate Rachel's new life in America, instead found themselves thrust into a nightmare. Their instincts told them something was terribly wrong, and their persistent efforts to get help would prove crucial to the investigation. They refused to simply leave, calling Priscilla and ultimately going to the Hopkinton police station to report Rachel as missing. The initial police response reflected the tragedy of missed opportunities that often characterize such cases. The patrol officers who first checked the house noticed that all windows and doors were locked, but they managed to gain entry using a card to slip the front door lock. Inside, they found signs of normal life. The television was still on, and the family dog, Sally, a basset hound, was barking from her crate. The officers' first concern was carbon monoxide poisoning, a common cause of family tragedies. But Sally's obvious good health ruled out that possibility. They heard classical music coming from what they assumed was Lillian's room and noticed a bathtub full of cold water, suggesting someone had been preparing for a bath. The master bedroom showed signs of recent occupation, with rumpled bedding and personal items scattered about. Crucially, the officers noticed that the family car was missing from the garage. Running the license plate revealed no accidents or incidents, leading them to conclude that the family had perhaps left for some emergency. With no obvious signs of violence or disturbance, they made the reasonable but ultimately tragic decision to leave the house and continue their investigation elsewhere. But Rachel's friends refused to accept this conclusion. Their intuition told them that Rachel would never simply disappear without explanation, especially not when she was expecting them for a visit she had been planning for weeks. Despite the freezing weather and the officers' warnings not to enter the house to avoid contaminating potential evidence, they spent the night in their car outside the Entwistle home, maintaining their vigil for their missing friend. Their persistence proved to be the key to discovering the truth. When the patrol officers returned the next day for a more thorough search, they were immediately struck by a terrible smell that had not been present the day before. Following the odor upstairs to the master bedroom, they made the crucial decision to lift the bed covers that they had left undisturbed during their initial search. The The discovery of Rachel's foot beneath the covers led to the horrifying revelation of both bodies. The sight that greeted the officers was one that would haunt them for years. A young mother and her infant daughter, victims of the most intimate betrayal imaginable. The master bedroom, which should have been a sanctuary of love and family life, had become a crime scene of unspeakable cruelty. The transformation of the Entwistle home into a crime scene brought with it the full machinery of a murder investigation. The house at 6 Cubs Path, which had so recently been filled with Rachel's laughter and Lillian's baby sounds, was suddenly swarming with detectives, medical examiners, and forensic specialists. Every room was photographed. Every surface was dusted for fingerprints. Every piece of evidence was carefully cataloged and preserved. The discovery of the family's white BMW at Logan International Airport, with the keys still in the ignition, provided the first concrete link between Neil's departure and the murders. This wasn't the behavior of a man fleeing in panic after discovering his family's bodies. It was a calculated action of someone who had planned his escape in advance and no longer needed a car because he was boarding an international flight. The phone calls that followed revealed the extent of Neil's manipulation and his complete lack of genuine emotion about his family's deaths. When Rachel's parents received a call from Neil's father, Clifford, they heard a story that was designed to generate sympathy rather than convey truth. According to Clifford, Neil had called him in a state of distress, claiming to have found Rachel and Lillian dead and to have called the police before driving to Joe and Priscilla's house for support. But when Joe and Priscilla compared the story with their own knowledge of events, inconsistencies immediately became apparent. No one had called the police the day before the bodies were discovered. Neil had not come to their house seeking comfort or support. Every detail of the story was designed to make Neil appear to be a victim rather than a perpetrator. When Neil himself called Joe, he repeated the same basic story but with subtle variations that revealed his guilty knowledge. Most tellingly, he omitted any mention of calling the police, likely because he knew Joe would be aware that no such call had been made. The conversation was a masterclass in manipulation, with Neil playing the role of the grieving widower, while carefully avoiding any details that might expose his lies. The phone call between Neil and Massachusetts State Police Sergeant Robert Manning was perhaps the most revealing of all. Manning, showing remarkable restraint and professionalism, spent nearly 2 hours on the phone with Neil, carefully gathering information while never directly accusing him of the crime. When Manning delivered the news that Rachel and Lillian were dead, Neil's response was chillingly simple. I know. That 2-word response revealed everything about Neil's true nature. There was no shock, no denial, no desperate questions about what had happened or who could have done such a thing. Just a calm acknowledgement of facts he already knew because he had created them himself. Manning, a veteran investigator, recognized immediately that he was speaking to the killer. Throughout the lengthy conversation, Neil continued to spin his web of lies, but the inconsistencies were becoming impossible to ignore. He claimed not to have Joe and Priscilla's work numbers, despite having lived with them for months. He said he had gotten lost trying to find Priscilla, despite knowing the area well. Most damning of all, he revealed his plan to retrieve a .22 pistol to take his own life, a detail that investigators immediately recognized as an attempt to return the murder weapon to its original location. Neil's behavior in the days following the murders revealed a complete absence of normal human emotion. While Rachel's family and friends were consumed with grief, while hundreds of people attended memorial services for a young mother and baby who had been loved by everyone who knew them, Neil was in England, calmly making arrangements to sell his story to the highest bidder, and even attempting to reconnect with old girlfriends. According to court documents, Neil Entwistle was looking to sell his story to the highest bidder and try to hook up with an old girlfriend when he was arrested in his native England. This behavior revealed the complete absence of genuine grief or remorse. While others mourned Rachel and Lillian, Neil was already planning how to profit from their deaths and resume his pursuit of selfish pleasures. The arrest itself was almost anticlimactic. Authorities received a tip that Neil had left a friend's house in Scotland and was on a train, possibly trying to disappear entirely. When they stopped the train and arrested him, They found a news clipping about escort services, revealing that even while fleeing from murder charges, Neil's mind was occupied with sexual gratification rather than any consideration of the lives he had destroyed. The evidence found during Neil's arrest painted a picture of a man whose priorities remained fundamentally corrupt even in the face of the most serious consequences imaginable. While normal people in his situation would be consumed with remorse, fear, or at least concern for their future, Neil was still pursuing the same selfish desires that had motivated his criminal behavior in the first place. When Neil was extradited back to Massachusetts to face charges, he began the next phase of his manipulation campaign, shifting blame to his victim. In a display of breathtaking cruelty, he claimed that when he found Rachel and Lillian, he immediately concluded it was a murder-suicide. According to this new version of events, he had found Joe's .22 revolver near the bodies and believed Rachel had killed Lillian before taking her own life. This story was not just a lie. It was an attack on Rachel's character and memory that added insult to the ultimate injury. The woman who had loved Neil unconditionally, who had given up her career and homeland to support his dreams, who had trusted him with her life and their daughter's life, was now being portrayed as a child killer by the very person who had actually committed the crime. The claim was as insulting to logic as it was to Rachel's memory. The physical evidence made Neil's story impossible. Rachel had been holding Lillian when they were shot, and the length of the gun made it physically impossible for her to have shot them both. Moreover, anyone who had known Rachel understood that she was incapable of harming her beloved daughter. The accusation revealed the depths of Neil's narcissism and his willingness to destroy even the memory of his victims to save himself. Rachel's family was devastated by this final betrayal. They had already lost their daughter and granddaughter to Neil's violence, and now they had to endure his public defamation of Rachel's character. The cruelty was almost unbearable. The man who had destroyed their family was now trying to make Rachel responsible for her own murder and her daughter's death. The trial itself was a study in contrast between the evidence and Neil's continued manipulation. His defense team, faced with overwhelming physical and circumstantial evidence, chose not to call any witnesses and did not have Neil testify on his own behalf. This decision likely reflected their understanding that Neil's narcissistic personality made him a poor witness for his own defense. His inability to show genuine remorse or emotion would only reinforce the prosecution's case. The defense's attempt to suggest that Rachel had used the gun was quickly demolished by forensic evidence. While Rachel's DNA was found inside the gun's barrel, likely from blood spattered during the shooting, no DNA from Rachel was found on the gun's grip. The grip contained DNA from Joe, his sons, and Neil, exactly what would be expected from the men who had handled the gun during their shooting sessions. This forensic evidence was crucial because it definitively proved that Rachel had not fired the gun. The DNA pattern was consistent with someone being shot by the weapon, not with someone using it to commit murder. Combined with the physical impossibility of the murder-suicide scenario, the evidence made Neil's guilt absolutely clear. The jury's verdict of guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder was swift and decisive. After only a day and a half of deliberations, they had concluded that Neil Entwistle had committed the most heinous crime possible, the calculated murder of his own wife and child. The judge's sentence of 2 life terms without the possibility of parole reflected the severity of the crime and the complete absence of any mitigating factors. Neil's reaction to the verdict was telling. He initially broke down, perhaps finally grasping the reality of the situation, but quickly composed himself into the stone-faced expression that had characterized much of his trial. Even in this moment of ultimate consequence, he seemed more concerned with maintaining a facade than expressing genuine remorse for his actions. The aftermath of the trial revealed that Neil's capacity for manipulation and self-delusion remained undiminished even in prison. His parents, Clifford and Vaughn, continued to maintain their son's innocence, even going so far as to repeat his vicious lies about Rachel. Their statement to the press after the sentencing was almost as cruel as Neil's original accusation, claiming that the evidence points to Rachel murdering our grandchild and then committing suicide. This continued support from his parents revealed one possible source of Neil's narcissistic personality, a family system that had always enabled his self-serving behavior and refused to hold him accountable for his actions. Even faced with overwhelming evidence of their son's guilt, they chose to maintain their delusions rather than acknowledge the truth about what he had become. Rachel's family's response to the verdict was more measured, but no less heartfelt. They acknowledged that while the guilty verdict provided some sense of justice, it could never erase the pain of their loss or bring back the two people they loved most in the world. Their dignity in the face of unimaginable loss stood in stark contrast to the continued lies and manipulations of Neil's family. The years following Neil's imprisonment revealed that his capacity for self-delusion and manipulation remained as strong as ever. In 2008, he was tricked by fellow inmates who convinced him that shaving his head would earn him protection from a white supremacist prison gang. Instead of protection, he was met with threats on his life, forcing him into protective custody, where he remains to this day. This incident revealed both Neil's continued gullibility and a complete inability to adapt to his new circumstances. The man who thought himself so clever, who had believed he could manipulate anyone, had been easily deceived by fellow prisoners who saw through pretensions immediately. Neil's continued attempts to overturn his conviction had become increasingly desperate and delusional. In recent years, he has claimed that a juror who was the same height as Rachel somehow violated his rights by reenacting the crime in the jury room. Entwistle, 44, claims he is indigent and is representing himself in these appeals, revealing that his grandiose dreams of wealth and success have been permanently shattered. His latest version of events, shared with pen pals from prison, claims that he never left the house on the day of the murders, but was instead in the kitchen when he heard gunshots from upstairs. According to this fabrication, he ran upstairs to find that Rachel had shot Lillian, and then watched Rachel take her own life. This story is even more implausible than his previous lies, but it reveals his continued inability to accept responsibility for his actions. The tragedy of the Entwistle murders extends far beyond the immediate loss of Rachel and Lillian's lives. It represents a destruction of trust, the violation of the most fundamental bonds of family, and a triumph of selfishness over love. Neil Entwistle had been given everything that should matter: a woman who loved him unconditionally, a beautiful daughter who represented hope and future, and the opportunity to build a meaningful life together. But Neil's psychological defects ran too deep for him to appreciate what he had. His shame about his background, his obsession with appearing successful, his need to manipulate and control others, and his fundamental inability to form genuine emotional connections made him incapable of the kind of love and commitment that family life requires. Instead of growing into the role of husband and father, he chose to destroy the people who depended on him most. The case serves as a chilling reminder that the people who seem most trustworthy, most loving, most committed to family, can sometimes be the most dangerous. Neil Entwistle fooled everyone: Rachel's family, friends, colleagues, and most tragically, Rachel herself. His ability to maintain his facade for so many years speaks to the sophisticated nature of his deception and the depth of his psychological dysfunction. The ripple effects of Neil's crimes continue to this day. Rachel's family has had to live not only with the loss of their beloved daughter and granddaughter, but also with the knowledge that their trust and love were weaponized against them. Joe Matarazzo, who had welcomed Neil as a son and shared his hobby of shooting, has had to live with the knowledge that his guns were used to murder his daughter and granddaughter. The guilt and self-recrimination that the surviving family members have endured represents another layer of victimization by Neil's actions. The community of Hopkinton, which had welcomed the young family with characteristic New England warmth, was shattered by the revelation that such evil could exist in their midst. The house at 6 Cubs Path, which should have been filled with the sounds of growing family, instead became a monument to betrayal and loss. The neighbors who had looked forward to watching Lillian grow up, who had perhaps imagined playdates and birthday parties, were forced to confront the reality that monsters don't always look like monsters. Rachel's colleagues and students at St. Augustine's Catholic School in England, who had said tearful goodbyes when she left for America, learned that their beloved teacher and friend had been murdered by the very person she had followed across the ocean. Their grief was compounded by the knowledge that Rachel had given up so much: her career, her friendships, her life in England, to support a man who would ultimately destroy her. The psychological profile that emerges from Neil's case is one of profound narcissistic personality disorder combined with psychopathic traits. His inability to form genuine emotional connections, his need for constant validation and admiration, his willingness to exploit others for personal gain, and his complete absence of empathy for his victims all point to severe personality disorders that made him fundamentally incapable of healthy relationships. What makes Neil's case particularly disturbing is the length of time over which he maintained his deception. This wasn't a sudden break from reality or a crime of passion. It was a culmination of years of lies, manipulation, and increasing desperation. His financial crimes, his sexual exploitation of others through his websites, his gambling addiction, and his elaborate schemes to maintain his lifestyle all revealed a pattern of behavior that treated other people as objects to be used rather than human beings deserving of respect and consideration. The progression from financial crimes to murder represents an escalation that experts in criminal psychology recognize as typical of certain personality types. When external pressures threaten the narcissist's carefully constructed self-image, when their lives become impossible to maintain, some will choose the most extreme solutions rather than face the consequences of their actions. For Neil, the prospect of admitting his failures, of being revealed as a fraud and a criminal, was apparently more unbearable than the thought of murdering his own family. The planning that went into murders, the research into killing methods, the reconnaissance of escort services, the booking of flights to England, all suggest that Neil had been contemplating this crime for weeks, if not months. This wasn't a moment of rage or desperation. It was a calculated decision to eliminate the people who represented his greatest responsibility and his greatest vulnerability to exposure. Perhaps most chilling is Neil's apparent belief that he could commit these murders and escape consequences entirely. His elaborate story about finding the bodies, his flight to England, his attempts to sell his story to media, all suggest that he believed he could manipulate public opinion and the justice system just as he had manipulated everyone else in his life. His narcissism was so complete that he seems to have genuinely believed he was smarter than the investigators, lawyers, and jurors who would ultimately determine his fate. The failure of this belief system has left Neil in a state of permanent cognitive dissonance. Rather than accepting responsibility for his actions, he has spent nearly 2 decades in prison creating increasingly elaborate alternative explanations for what happened. His various stories, from the initial claim of innocence to the accusation that Rachel committed murder-suicide to his latest fabrication about hearing gunshots from the kitchen, all serve the same psychological function: protecting his ego from the unbearable truth about what he has become. This psychological protection mechanism has prevented Neil from experiencing the genuine remorse that might offer some small measure of redemption. Instead, he remains trapped in his own narcissistic delusions, unable to acknowledge the reality of his crimes or the depth of the pain he has caused. His continued attempts to overturn his conviction, his claims of procedural violations, and his elaborate conspiracy theories all serve to maintain the fiction that he is a victim rather than a perpetrator. The contrast between Neil's current circumstances and his former dreams of wealth and status could not be more stark. The man who was obsessed with appearing successful and sophisticated now lives in a small prison cell, dependent on others for his most basic needs, his every movement monitored and controlled. His grandiose fantasies of wealth and power have been replaced by the grinding reality of institutional life, where his manipulation skills are worthless and his true character is fully exposed. Yet even in these circumstances, Neil appears to lack the capacity for genuine self-reflection or growth. His prison communications reveal the same self-serving perspective, the same inability to acknowledge the pain of others, the same focus on his own perceived victimization. The years of imprisonment have not produced the psychological transformation that might come from genuine confrontation with his crimes. For the families and communities affected by Neil's crimes, his continued denials and manipulations represent an ongoing source of pain. Every appeal, every news story, every attempt to shift blame forces them to relive the trauma of his original crimes. The legal system, designed to provide closure and justice, instead becomes a vehicle for Neil's continued psychological abuse of his victims' loved ones. The media attention that the case has generated over the years, the documentaries, books, and articles, while serving to keep Rachel and Lillian's memory alive, also provides Neil with the attention and notoriety that his narcissistic personality craves. Even negative attention serves as psychological needs, reinforcing his sense of importance and significance. The irony is crushing. The man who murdered his family to escape responsibility has achieved a kind of fame through his crimes, though it is a fame of infamy rather than the success he originally sought. The Entwistle case stands as one of the most heartbreaking examples of family annihilation in recent memory, not just because of the innocent lives lost, but because of complete betrayal of trust it represents. Rachel Entwistle believed she was building a life with someone who loved her and their daughter. Instead, she was living with someone who saw her as an obstacle to his own gratification, someone who was capable of the most intimate violence imaginable. The tragedy extends to little Lillian, who never had the chance to experience life beyond her first 9 months. She will never know the joy of her first steps, her first words, her first day of school, or any of the countless milestones that mark a human life. Her potential, her future, her very existence were extinguished by the person who should have been her greatest protector. Today, nearly 2 decades after the murders, Neil Entwistle remains in protective custody at the Old Colony Correctional Center in Massachusetts. At 55 years old, he faces the rest of his life in prison, his dreams of wealth and status permanently shattered. The boy from Worksop who was so ashamed of his working-class background has achieved a notoriety that far exceeds anything his father, the coal miner, or his mother, the cafeteria worker, ever experienced. But it is the notoriety of evil rather than achievement. The house at 6 Cubs Path in Hopkinton has been sold to new owners who have worked to erase the memories of what happened there. But for those who knew and loved Rachel and Lillian, no amount of time or distance can fully heal the wounds left by Neil's crimes. Their deaths represent not just the loss of 2 precious lives, but the destruction of faith in the fundamental bonds of family and marriage. The case serves as a permanent reminder that evil can wear the most familiar faces, that the people we trust most completely can sometimes be the most dangerous, and that the capacity for violence exists even in those who seem most unlikely to commit it. Neil Entwistle looked like a loving husband and father, spoke like an educated professional, and acted like a devoted family man. But beneath the surface, he was a predator who used his own family's love and trust as weapons against them. In the end, Neil Entwistle's story is not one of successful crime or a clever deception, but a complete moral bankruptcy that can result when narcissism and selfishness are allowed to flourish unchecked. His crimes solved none of his problems, achieved none of his goals, and brought him none of the satisfaction he sought. Instead, they destroyed everything good in his life and condemned him to spend his remaining years confronting the consequences of his unforgivable choices. The memory of Rachel and Lillian Entwistle lives on in the hearts of those who loved them, a testament to the joy and love that Neil's violence tried but failed to extinguish completely. Their story serves as both a tragedy and a warning, a reminder that the most precious things in life are often the most fragile, and that the people we choose to trust with our hearts and our futures hold the power to either nurture or destroy everything we hold dear. Justice was served when Neil Entwistle was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole, but no legal verdict can truly compensate for the magnitude of his crimes. The only appropriate response to such evil is to remember his victims not as statistics in a crime story, but as real people whose lives had value, whose deaths represent irreplaceable losses, and whose memory deserves to be honored with something more than the infamy of their killer. Rachel Entwistle was 27 years old when she died, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her, a devoted teacher and loving mother who had so much more to give to the world. Lillian was just 9 months old, a baby whose smile could light up a room and whose laughter brought joy to everyone who heard it. They deserved so much better than the fate that befell them, and their memory deserves better than to be overshadowed by the man who destroyed their lives. In remembering their story, we honor not just their memory, but our own commitment to protecting the innocent, cherishing our families, and recognizing the precious fragility of the love and trust that bind us together. Neil Entwistle's crimes represent the worst of human nature, but the love that Rachel and Lillian shared, and the love that their family and friends continue to feel for them, represents the best of what we can be.